Before the sun has touched the chimneys, before the first carriage wheels have crunched against gravel, there is already movement inside the great house. A scullery maid, no older than 14, kneels before a cold grate in the dark, her fingers black with the previous day's ash, coaxing a new fire to life so that by the time the family stirs, the rooms above will already be warm. Somewhere beneath her feet, in a kitchen lit only by a single oil lamp, a cook is already kneading dough for the morning's bread, her sleeves rolled, her breath visible in the chill. Outside, in the half-light, a stable boy leads a horse across frost-hardened cobbles, and far above him, behind a window framed in carved stone, a wealthy family sleeps undisturbed beneath layers of imported linen, utterly unaware of the small army already at work to make their day seem effortless. This was the secret rhythm of a Victorian mansion, a rhythm most visitors to these houses, then and now, never fully understood. Beneath the gleaming chandeliers and the polished mahogany staircases lay a hidden world of human labor, sacrifice, and extraordinary skill, much of it deliberately concealed behind servants' doors and narrow back staircases, so that the family upstairs might never see the machinery of their own comfort. Who were the people who built these houses, stone by stone, beam by beam? Who were the men who climbed perilous scaffolding 60 feet above the ground, and the women who scrubbed floors before dawn so that wealth might appear seamless and effortless? Their names rarely appear in the glossy guidebooks sold at the gift shops of preserved estates today, yet without them, none of these astonishing buildings would exist at all. This is their story as much as it is the story of the families whose names were carved into foundation stones. To understand why these mansions rose up across the British countryside and across America's growing cities in such extraordinary numbers during the 19th century, we must first understand the seismic shifts taking place in the wider world. The Victorian era, spanning roughly from 1837 to 1901 in Britain and overlapping with the Gilded Age in the United States, was a period of staggering economic transformation. Industrialization had unleashed wealth on a scale previous generations could scarcely have imagined. Factory owners who had begun as modest manufacturers found themselves, within a single generation, sitting atop fortunes built on cotton, iron, coal, and railways. Bankers and merchants amassed capital through global trade networks that stretched from Manchester's textile mills to the tea plantations of India and the cotton fields of the American South. Landed aristocrats, whose wealth had traditionally come from inherited estates and agricultural rents, suddenly found themselves competing for social prestige with self-made industrialists who possessed fortunes far exceeding their own. In this newly fluid social landscape, a mansion became something more than a home. It became a declaration. It announced to the world that its owner had arrived, that they possessed not merely money, but taste, lineage, and permanence, even when that permanence had been purchased only a decade earlier, with profits from a cotton mill or a shipping line. Historians studying this period generally agree that the building of grand houses during the 19th century cannot be separated from this anxious, competitive performance of status, though scholars continue to debate the precise balance between genuine aesthetic ambition and pure social calculation in any individual case. The decision to build began long before a single stone was laid. Wealthy families searched for land with the same care a general might devote to choosing a battlefield, because location communicated as much as architecture itself. Proximity to a fashionable city allowed for easy entertaining and access to society, while distance from industrial smoke and the visible poverty of factory districts allowed a family to enjoy the illusion that their wealth existed in a world entirely separate from the labor that produced it. Elevated positions were prized, both for their commanding views and their healthier air, since Victorians held deep and not entirely unfounded beliefs about the dangers of low-lying damp ground and the miasmas believed to cause disease. A site near a river or canal eased the transport of building materials, while a position along an emerging railway line promised that future generations of guests could arrive without the discomfort of long carriage journeys across rutted country roads. Once land was secured, families turned to architects, and this relationship between patron and designer became one of the defining creative partnerships of the era. Architects such as those associated with the Gothic Revival movement, inspired by the writings of figures like Augustus Pugin, and later championed by critics such as John Ruskin, argued that medieval forms represented not merely aesthetic preference, but moral and spiritual truth, a rejection of what they saw as the soulless uniformity of industrial design. Pointed arches, steep gables, and ornate tracery borrowed from medieval cathedrals began appearing on country houses across Britain, transforming private residences into structures that echoed the grandeur of churches and castles. Meanwhile, the Italianate style offered a different vision entirely, drawing on the symmetry and classical proportions of Renaissance villas, with low-pitched roofs, overhanging eaves, and elegant towers that suggested cultivated travel and refined taste. Tudor Revival architecture summoned an idealized vision of England's pre-industrial past, with half-timbering tall chimneys and leaded glass windows that spoke of ancient lineage, even when the family commissioning the house had only recently acquired its fortune. In the United States, Queen Anne Revival houses embraced asymmetry and ornamental exuberance, with wraparound porches, turrets, and a riotous mixture of textures and materials that architectural historians often describe as a distinctly American reinterpretation of British Victorian fashion. Whatever style a family chose, the planning process typically stretched across months, with architects producing detailed drawings, models, and specifications that had to account for everything from structural load-bearing requirements to the precise placement of service corridors that would allow servants to move unseen. If you are finding this journey into the hidden history of these remarkable houses as fascinating as I do, I would invite you to press that like button now, because there is still so much more of this extraordinary story ahead, and your support helps bring more of these forgotten histories to light. Once the plans were finalized, the real labor began, and it began not with elegance but with mud, sweat, and brute force. Excavation crews, often numbering in the dozens, dug foundations by hand using picks, shovels, and horse-drawn carts, since steam-powered excavation equipment remained rare and expensive for private residential projects through much of the century. The depth and complexity of these foundations depended on soil conditions, and architects who had studied geology carefully selected foundation designs to prevent the settling and cracking that plagued poorly planned structures. Once foundations were laid, typically using rubble stone or, increasingly as the century progressed, early forms of concrete, the painstaking work of raising walls began. Stonemasons occupied a position of particular respect among Victorian building trades, having typically served apprenticeships lasting up to 7 years before being permitted to work independently on fine ornamental carving. Their tools, chisels, mallets, and specialized hammers passed down sometimes through generations of the same family allowed them to transform raw blocks of limestone, sandstone, or granite into perfectly fitted walls and intricate decorative details, from gargoyles peering down from roof lines to delicate floral patterns framing windows and doorways. Bricklayers working with bricks fired in local brickworks or, for finer work, imported from specialized manufacturers known for particular colors and textures, built walls with a precision that left little room for error, since a poorly laid course could compromise the structural integrity of everything built above it. Timber framers, working primarily on roof structures and interior framing even in masonry buildings, used techniques refined over centuries, joining massive oak or pine beams with mortise and tenon joints secured by wooden pegs, a method that required both mathematical precision and an intimate understanding of how wood would behave as it aged and settled. Roofing specialists installed slate, often quarried in Wales for British mansions or in Vermont and Pennsylvania for American ones, cutting each tile by hand to fit the specific angles of complex Victorian rooflines, featuring multiple gables, dormers, and towers. Chimneys, essential not merely for warmth but as architectural statements in their own right, required specialized bricklaying skills to ensure proper draft and to prevent the dangerous buildup of creosote that could ignite and burn a house to the ground, a fear that haunted Victorian households with good reason, since fire remained one of the most catastrophic and common dangers facing any large wooden-floored, gas-lit residence. The materials that gave these mansions their distinctive character traveled remarkable distances before reaching their final resting place in a wall or ceiling. Limestone might come from quarries in Indiana or the Cotswolds, marble from Italy or Vermont, slate from Welsh mountainsides, and decorative ironwork from foundries in Glasgow or Pittsburgh that had perfected the casting of intricate balustrades, gates, and fireplace surrounds. Stained glass, increasingly fashionable as the century progressed, required artisans with specialized knowledge of glass chemistry and lead came construction, and firms such as those associated with the arts and crafts movement later in the century elevated this craft into genuine fine art, with figures like Louis Comfort Tiffany in America developing innovative techniques for creating glass with extraordinary depth of color and texture. The transportation of these materials depended heavily on the expanding canal and railway networks that themselves represented one of the era's great industrial achievements. Before a single railway spur reached a remote estate, materials often traveled by canal barge for the initial leg of their journey, then by horse-drawn wagon over the final miles, a logistical challenge that required careful coordination and added substantially to construction costs and timelines. As railways expanded throughout the latter half of the century, building materials could increasingly be delivered directly to construction sites, dramatically accelerating the pace at which mansions could be completed, and allowing architects greater freedom to specify materials from distant regions without prohibitive transportation costs. I want to pause here and invite you, if you haven't already, to subscribe to this channel, because the story of these houses is far from finished, and there are entire chapters still ahead about the people who lived within these walls, both upstairs and down. It would be a disservice to the men and women who built these mansions to romanticize their labor as some noble, picturesque pursuit untouched by hardship. The historical record, preserved in wage ledgers, coroners' reports, trade union records, and the writings of social reformers, paints a far more demanding picture. Construction workers typically labored 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, with work often beginning at first light and continuing until dusk made further progress impossible. Scaffolding constructed from lashed timber poles without the safety regulations that govern modern construction sites presented constant danger, and falls from height ranked among the most common causes of serious injury and death in the building trades throughout the 19th century. Stonemasons faced the particular hazard of silicosis, a debilitating lung disease caused by years of inhaling fine stone dust, a condition not yet well understood medically, and for which there existed no effective protective equipment. Heavy lifting, performed largely without mechanical assistance beyond simple pulleys and block and tackle systems, took a brutal toll on workers' bodies, with chronic back injuries and hernias common among men who spent decades hauling stone, timber, and brick. Winter construction brought its own dangers, with frozen mortar failing to set properly and workers risking frostbite and exposure as they continued laboring through harsh weather, since interrupted construction meant interrupted wages for men paid by the day or by piece rate rather than salary. Wages varied considerably by trade and skill level, with master craftsmen such as experienced stonemasons or skilled carpenters earning considerably more than unskilled laborers, though even skilled tradesmen's earnings could fluctuate dramatically depending on the availability of work, and economic downturns left many construction workers facing genuine hardship. Trade unions gradually gaining strength through the latter half of the century fought for improved wages and working conditions, though progress was uneven and contested, with employers often resisting reforms that threatened to slow construction timelines or increase costs. Within the completed mansion, an entirely separate architectural language governed the spaces meant for servants, distinct enough that historians and architects sometimes describe these houses as containing two buildings occupying the same footprint. Service staircases, narrow and steep compared to the grand sweeping staircases reserved for family and guests, allowed servants to move between floors without crossing paths with the people they served. Hidden doors, sometimes disguised as bookshelves or wall paneling in libraries and drawing rooms, allowed servants to enter rooms to tend fires or clear dishes without disrupting the visual harmony the family wished to present. Bell systems, mechanically connected by wires running through walls to a board in the servants' hall, allowed family members to summon specific servants to specific rooms without ever leaving their seats, while speaking tubes, simple but effective devices consisting of pipes running between floors, enabled verbal communication between, for instance, a kitchen and a distant dining room, allowing meal timing to be coordinated with precision. Despite the physical distance servants were expected to maintain from the family's daily life. Below stairs, the kitchen formed the operational heart of the household, typically positioned at some distance from the dining room to keep cooking smells and noise away from family living spaces, a separation that created enormous logistical challenges for serving hot food, challenges solved through dedicated serving corridors and, in the largest houses, specially designed warming rooms where dishes could be kept at temperature during their journey from kitchen to table. Sculleries handled the washing of pots and dishes, a task considered among the lowest in the household hierarchy, and typically assigned to the youngest or newest female servants. Laundries, often housed in separate buildings to contain the heat and steam generated by large coppers used for boiling linens, required enormous physical effort, with laundry maids handling heavy wet fabric, operating mangles to wring out water, and using flat irons heated on stoves to press the household's vast collection of linens, a process that consumed entire days of labor each week. Coal cellars, typically accessed from outside the house to avoid tracking coal dust through living spaces, stored the fuel that powered the household's many fireplaces, while pantries and still rooms preserved food and prepared items like jams, pickles, and cordials that could be stored for months. Servants themselves typically slept in the attic, in rooms considerably smaller and more sparsely furnished than anything found in the family's quarters below, with male and female servants strictly segregated, often on entirely different floors or wings, reflecting the era's rigid concerns about propriety even within the household's own staff. If a particular detail here has caught your attention, I would love to hear about it in the comments below, because every viewer seems to find a different piece of this hidden world the most surprising, and I genuinely enjoy reading which details resonate most. The rooms designed for the family and their guests told an entirely different story, one of curated luxury intended to impress and overwhelm the senses from the moment a visitor stepped through the front door. Entrance halls often featured soaring ceilings, elaborate plasterwork, and grand staircases designed as much for dramatic descent during evening entertainments as for practical movement between floors. Drawing rooms, the primary space for receiving guests and conducting the elaborate social rituals of Victorian visiting culture, typically featured the finest furniture a family owned, often upholstered in silk or velvet, alongside wallpapers produced by manufacturers like William Morris, whose intricate botanical and geometric patterns became enormously fashionable among families wishing to display both wealth and aesthetic sophistication. Libraries held leather-bound volumes, sometimes purchased more for their visual impact on shelves than for their content, alongside reading chairs positioned near windows or fireplaces, and globes, telescopes, or scientific instruments that signaled a family's claim to intellectual cultivation. Dining rooms, the setting for elaborate multi-course meals governed by precise rules of etiquette, featured long tables capable of seating dozens of guests, illuminated by candles, or, as the century progressed, increasingly by gas fixtures and eventually early electric lighting in the wealthiest and most modern households. Conservatories, glass-enclosed spaces that became enormously popular, following advances in glass manufacturing and structural ironwork pioneered in buildings like the Crystal Palace, allowed families to cultivate exotic plants gathered from across the expanding British Empire, or in America, from botanical expeditions to South America and Asia, creating indoor gardens that functioned as both horticultural achievement and social spectacle. Bedrooms, particularly the principal suites occupied by the head of household and his wife, often featured elaborately carved four-poster beds, marble-topped washstands, and dressing rooms stocked with garments requiring the daily assistance of personal maids or valets to don properly, given the complexity of Victorian fashion with its layers of undergarments, corsetry, and structured outerwear. Throughout the construction and furnishing of these rooms, technological innovation gradually transformed daily life within Victorian mansions, though adoption varied considerably depending on a family's wealth, location, and willingness to embrace new conveniences. Gas lighting, increasingly common from the mid-19th century onward, replaced candles and oil lamps in many grand houses, requiring the installation of gas pipes throughout walls and ceilings, a significant undertaking that fundamentally altered architectural planning, since chandeliers and wall fixtures now needed to accommodate gas lines rather than simply holding candles. By the final decades of the century, the wealthiest and most forward-looking families began installing early electrical systems, often running parallel to existing gas fixtures during a transitional period when many households hedged their bets by maintaining both systems, uncertain whether electricity represented a passing novelty or a permanent transformation. Indoor plumbing, similarly, spread gradually rather than appearing instantaneously, with many mansions initially relying on elaborate systems of water storage tanks positioned in attics or towers, from which gravity fed water down to bathrooms and kitchens, supplemented by servants who continued to carry hot water in cans, for baths well into the era of indoor plumbing, since heating sufficient water for a proper bath remained technically challenging. Central heating systems, typically based on hot water or steam, circulated through pipes to radiators, began appearing in the wealthiest homes by the latter half of the century, though many mansions continued to rely primarily on fireplaces in every room, a system that demanded an enormous and continuous supply of coal or wood, and the constant labor of servants, tasked with maintaining dozens of fires throughout a single building each day. A single day within one of these mansions reveals the intricate choreography required to maintain the appearance of effortless luxury. Servants typically rose between 4 and 5 in the morning, well before the family, beginning their work in darkness or by candlelight, cleaning grates, laying new fires, and preparing the house for the day ahead. Housemaids swept and dusted rooms in a specific order, designed to avoid encountering family members, since servants were generally expected to make themselves invisible, stepping into side corridors or turning to face walls if a family member happened to pass. Breakfast, served considerably later for the family than the servant's own meal, might be a substantial affair featuring eggs, meats, breads, and preserves laid out on a sideboard for family members to serve themselves, a practice that reduced the need for servants to remain in the room throughout the meal. The middle of the day often brought visitors, since Victorian social life revolved heavily around the ritual of calling, with strict rules governing who might visit whom, how long a visit should last, and the proper use of calling cards left with servants at the door. Afternoon activities for family members might include correspondence, needlework, music practice, or outdoor pursuits like riding or walking through carefully landscaped gardens, while below stairs, servants continued an unending cycle of cleaning, food preparation, and maintenance tasks that left little idle time throughout the day. Evening brought the most elaborate demands, particularly when the family hosted dinner parties, events that could require weeks of planning and coordination between the cook, the butler, and often a small army of additional temporary staff hired specifically for the occasion. A formal dinner might extend through numerous courses, each requiring different china, glassware, and silver, all of which needed to be cleaned, polished, and properly arranged both before and after the meal. Only once the family had finally retired for the night, often well past midnight after an evening of entertainment, could the household staff begin their own final tasks, banking fires for the night and securing the house before snatching what rest remained before the cycle began again only a few hours later. Before we continue into the financial realities that governed these magnificent estates, if you're enjoying this deep dive into Victorian life, please consider sharing this documentary with anyone you know who shares a love of history, as it genuinely helps these stories reach a wider audience. Maintaining a Victorian mansion demanded financial resources that extended far beyond the initial cost of construction, and many families, despite their evident wealth, found themselves perpetually strained by the ongoing expenses required to sustain their grand residences. Domestic staff alone represented a substantial and continuous expenditure, with larger households employing anywhere from a dozen to several dozen servants, each requiring wages, room, board, and often uniforms or livery, particularly for male servants in visible positions like footmen, whose appearance reflected directly on the family's status. Heating costs proved enormous, given the sheer volume of coal required to warm dozens of rooms across multiple floors throughout long winters, while the candles, oil, and later gas required for lighting added further continuous expense. Food for both family and staff required substantial ongoing investment, particularly for households that maintained kitchen gardens, greenhouses for out-of-season produce, and relationships with specialized suppliers for items like exotic fruits or fine wines that signaled culinary sophistication. The maintenance of horses and carriages, essential for transportation before the widespread adoption of automobiles, required stables, grooms, coachmen, and a continuous supply of feed, alongside veterinary care and the replacement of carriages and harnesses as they wore out. Gardens, often as elaborately designed as the house itself, demanded teams of gardeners working year-round to maintain formal landscaping, kitchen gardens, greenhouses, and ornamental features like fountains or follies, while property taxes and insurance added further financial obligations that scaled with the size and value of the estate. Furnishings required periodic replacement or updating as fashions changed, and the ongoing maintenance of the building itself, from repairing slate roofs damaged by storms to repainting elaborate woodwork, represented a continuous drain on resources that never truly ceased. Historians studying estate records have found that some families, despite outward appearances of boundless wealth, struggled considerably to sustain these costs, particularly as agricultural income declined toward the end of the century, or as industrial fortunes proved less stable than anticipated, a reality that complicates any simple narrative of effortless Victorian prosperity. A number of popular misconceptions have grown up around Victorian mansions in the years since their construction, and it serves the historical record well to address several of these directly. One persistent myth suggests that secret passages were commonly built into these houses for purposes of intrigue or escape, when in reality, the hidden corridors and concealed doors found in many mansions served the entirely practical purpose of allowing servants to move unseen, a feature of household management rather than evidence of conspiracy or secrecy in any sinister sense. Another common misunderstanding holds that all Victorian mansions featured electricity and modern plumbing from their construction, when historical evidence makes clear that these technologies arrived gradually and unevenly, with many grand houses relying on candles, oil lamps, and chamber pots well into the late 19th century, particularly in more remote rural locations where infrastructure lagged behind urban centers. Some popular accounts exaggerate the uniformity of servant experiences, suggesting all domestic staff endured identical hardship, when in fact the historical record reveals considerable variation in treatment, wages, and working conditions depending on the individual household, the specific role a servant occupied, and the personal character of the family they served, with some employers documented as treating their staff with genuine consideration, while others were notably harsh. It is also worth noting that not every grand Victorian house was inhabited by old aristocratic families. Many were built by newly wealthy industrialists eager to establish social legitimacy, a fact that contemporary observers and later historians alike have used to explore the complex and often anxious relationship between old and new money during this period of rapid social change. As the 20th century approached and eventually arrived, the fate of these mansions diverged dramatically, depending on a combination of economic circumstance, family fortune, and historical accident. Some estates remained within the same families for generations, carefully maintained through changing economic conditions, and eventually opened to the public as museums or historic sites, preserving their architecture and contents as windows into Victorian life. Others fell victim to the economic pressures of declining agricultural income, heavy taxation, or the simple impossibility of maintaining such vast establishments without the army of affordable domestic labor that had once made them feasible, a labor supply that diminished considerably as industrial and later wartime employment offered alternatives to domestic service. Some mansions were demolished outright, their materials sold for salvage, their grounds subdivided for housing developments as cities expanded outward and land values shifted. Others were repurposed entirely, transformed into schools, hospitals, or institutional buildings, whose new functions sometimes preserved the architectural shell while erasing much of the original interior character. Still others survived through fortunate circumstance, acquired by preservation societies, museums, or government bodies recognizing their historical and architectural significance before deterioration became irreversible, allowing later generations to walk through rooms once occupied by Victorian families and the servants who maintained their world. Walking through one of these surviving mansions today, whether as a visitor admiring carved staircases and stained glass, or as a historian examining estate ledgers and servants' diaries, offers a rare and precious window into an extraordinary moment in architectural and social history, one built through remarkable craftsmanship, sustained by largely invisible labor, and ultimately shaped by forces of wealth, ambition, and changing fortune that determined which of these magnificent houses would endure and which would vanish entirely from the landscape, leaving behind only photographs, records, and the enduring fascination of those who continue to study them. Please leave a comment, and share. Thank you.